The gun clicked as Karen aimed it at my chest, her hands trembling with rage. "Take it down," she hissed, her voice sharp as broken glass. "Or I swear, you'll regret it." My heart pounded, but I didn't move. I had spent years building this life, securing this land, and I wasn't about to let some power-hungry HOA tyrant steal it from me. The lake behind me shimmered under the setting sun, its stillness a stark contrast to the storm raging before me. I clenched my fists, jaw tight, staring into her wild, unhinged eyes. She was willing to cross a line I never expected. But what she didn't realize was I had already crossed mine. This wasn't just about a lake anymore. This was about standing my ground, about fighting back. And no amount of threats, no amount of HOA intimidation was going to make me back down. Love seeing entitled people get what they deserve. Subscribe for more crazy stories like this. The letter had arrived that morning. Plain white envelope, no different from any of the others I had tossed onto the kitchen counter. But the moment I slid my finger under the seal and unfolded the crisp paper, my stomach twisted into a hard knot. "Violation of property rights," it read. "Failure to comply with HOA regulations will result in fines and legal action." My eyes darted across the page, trying to make sense of the words. The HOA. The same busybodies who had spent the past 3 years nitpicking every detail of my property were now claiming that my lake wasn't mine at all, that it was a public resource, that anyone, any stranger, any entitled neighbor had the right to waltz onto my land, splash into my water, and take it as their own. I gripped the letter so hard it crumpled in my hands. The audacity, the sheer nerve. The lake wasn't just some patch of water. It was the reason I had bought this land in the first place, the heart of my home, the sanctuary where my family had spent countless summer evenings fishing, swimming, escaping the chaos of the outside world. And now these self-important HOA parasites wanted to claim it, to rip away what was mine, just because they thought they could. My pulse pounded in my ears. Over the years, I had tolerated their nonsense, their complaints about the height of my fence, the color of my mailbox, even the length of my grass. But this was war. Emily walked into the kitchen, her expression soft with early morning grogginess, but the moment she saw my face, her smile faded. "What's wrong?" she asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be good. I handed her the letter, watching her face as she read. The color drained from her cheeks. "This has to be a mistake," she said, shaking her head. "They can't just take it from us. It's ours. Apparently, they think otherwise." I tossed the letter onto the table, my voice tight. "But they're wrong. I'm not letting this happen." Emily placed a hand on my arm, her fingers cold against my skin. "What are we going to do?" I didn't hesitate. "We're putting up a fence." By noon, I had already made the first trip to the hardware store, my truck loaded down with wood, nails, concrete. If the HOA thought they could stake a claim on my property, they were about to get a very loud, very permanent message otherwise. As I unloaded the supplies, I felt the eyes of my neighbors watching me from their windows, their driveways, their porches. Whispers carried on the breeze, judgmental stares pressing into my back. Let them talk. Let them gossip. This was my land, my lake, my fight. The first post went into the ground with a deep, satisfying thud. Then another, and another. Sweat dripped down my back as I worked under the blistering sun, hammer swinging with the force of my anger. Emily stood nearby, uneasy but determined, handing me nails, adjusting the planks, wiping sweat from her forehead. Then, just as I drove the final nail into the first section of the fence, I heard the sound of tires crunching over gravel. I looked up to see a sleek black car rolling to a stop at the edge of my property. My hands tightened around the hammer as the door swung open and a familiar figure stepped out. Karen, with her perfect blonde bob, her too-tight cardigan, and that ever-present clipboard clutched in her bony fingers. She looked at me like I was some unruly child who had just colored outside the lines. She marched forward, her expression twisted with faux concern. Well, she said, eyes scanning the fence. Someone's being a little territorial. I didn't bother responding. I just kept working. Karen let out a small, condescending chuckle. You know this won't stand, right? She continued, stepping closer. The lake isn't yours, and this fence is a direct violation of HOA policy. I turned to her, my expression cold. The lake is on my land, Karen. My property. I have the deed to prove it. She pursed her lips, shaking her head as if I were some ignorant fool. The HOA has determined that the lake should be accessible to the community. It's only fair. I laughed, a sharp, humorless sound. Fair? You mean fair like when you fine me for having my Christmas lights up a day too long? Or fair like when you try to tell me what color I could paint my own damn house? Karen's eyes darkened, but her voice remained sickeningly sweet. I'm just trying to maintain harmony in the neighborhood. Harmony? I stepped closer, lowering my voice. You're trying to steal what isn't yours. She didn't flinch. Take the fence down or the HOA will escalate this. I leaned in slightly, voice like steel. Let them. Karen's jaw tightened. She took a slow breath, then gave me a look I had seen before, the look of a woman who didn't hear no very often. You will regret this, she said. I smiled. We'll see. She spun on her heel and walked back to her car, her movement stiff with rage. I watched as she drove off, my pulse still pounding. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And I had a feeling it was going to get a whole lot worse before it got better. The sun barely had time to rise the next morning before the fight escalated. I woke to the sound of my phone buzzing relentlessly on the nightstand, a barrage of notifications lighting up the screen. Messages from numbers I barely recognized, neighbors, and even strangers from within the HOA were flooding in. Some were veiled threats, others outright demands. A few had the audacity to sound concerned, as if they were trying to help me see the error of my ways. I didn't need their concern. I needed them to leave me the hell alone. I ignored the messages, tossing my phone onto the counter, and stepped outside to check on the fence. My gut told me something was coming, and I wasn't wrong. The moment I opened the door, I saw them. A small gathering of people standing at the edge of my property, hushed voices carrying in the morning air. Ted, another HOA board member, was at the center of the group, talking animatedly, pointing toward the fence, shaking his head. They hadn't even given me a full 24 hours before making their move. I didn't say a word as I walked past them, heading straight for the fence, but I could feel their eyes on me, judgmental and expectant, waiting for me to snap. Instead, I checked the fence posts, making sure nothing had been tampered with, running my hands over the sturdy wood as if reaffirming my claim over the land. The fence was still solid. That was something at least. As I turned to head back inside, Ted finally spoke. This isn't going to end well for you, he said, his voice carrying that smug, authoritative tone HOA members love to use. You're making a mistake. I let out a slow breath before turning to face him. The only mistake I made was thinking I could live here in peace without people like you sticking your noses where they don't belong. Ted smirked. You're breaking the rules. No, I said, stepping closer. I'm protecting what's mine. The group behind him murmured, shifting uncomfortably, but Ted didn't back down. His smile widened, a predator who thought he already had his prey trapped. We've already filed the first formal complaint, he said. If you don't take the fence down, we'll have no choice but to escalate things. Fines, legal action. You really want to go through all that? I crossed my arms, staring him down. I can promise you one thing, Ted. I'm not the one who's going to regret this. His smirk faltered for just a second, but then he turned, making a show of gesturing to the group before leading them away. I watched as they walked back to their homes, shaking their heads like I was some sort of madman who refused to follow the rules of their little kingdom. But I didn't care. They had no idea who they were dealing with. By the afternoon, things had escalated even further. I had just finished reinforcing a section of the fence when Emily called me from inside, her voice tight with anger. I stepped inside and found her standing by the living room window, her phone clenched in her hand, eyes burning with fury. "They posted it online," she said, shoving the phone toward me. I took it and scanned the screen. The HOA had taken pictures of the fence and posted them in the neighborhood group chat, twisting the story to fit their narrative. "Selfish homeowner builds an illegal fence to block a community lake." The caption read, followed by a flood of comments from people who had never so much as spoken to me, calling me entitled, calling me a menace, demanding that I take the fence down. Some even went as far as saying they'd tear it down themselves if the HOA didn't handle it. "They're turning everyone against us," Emily muttered, her hands shaking. "I can't believe this." I clenched my jaw. I expected pushback, but this was on a whole other level. They weren't just fighting me legally. They were trying to ruin my reputation, trying to isolate us, turn our neighbors into enemies. I exhaled sharply and tossed the phone onto the couch. "Let them talk." Emily turned to me, frustration in her eyes. "How can you be so calm?" I ran a hand through my hair, my pulse steady despite the rage boiling underneath. Because I knew this was coming, I admitted. The HOA doesn't like to lose. They'll throw everything they have at us before they realize they're wasting their time. She hesitated, then sighed, rubbing her temples. "I just don't know how far they'll go." That answer came sooner than either of us expected. That night, long after the neighborhood had gone quiet, I heard something outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, rustling through the trees, but then I heard it again, a faint metallic clink, the unmistakable sound of tools against wood. I moved fast, grabbing a flashlight and heading for the door, my heart pounding with adrenaline. The second I stepped outside, the beam of my flashlight caught movement near the fence. Figures. 2, maybe 3 people crouched near the fence line, tools in hand, trying to undo my work in the dead of night. "Hey!" I shouted, charging forward. The figures bolted, one of them tripping over the uneven ground as they scrambled to escape. I chased them to the edge of my property, stopping just short of the street, watching as they disappeared into the shadows. My breath came fast, my hands clenched into fists. I didn't need to see their faces to know exactly who they were. I stalked back to the fence, scanning the damage. A few nails had been pried loose, but nothing serious. I'd caught them before they could do any real harm. I let out a slow breath, my muscles still tense. This was their next move. By morning, I was already reinforcing the fence again, making it stronger, making it clear that I wasn't backing down. Emily stayed inside, glued to the phone, keeping an eye on the HOA's next play. It didn't take long. Around noon, a new email arrived, this one more aggressive than before. It wasn't just a fine this time. It was a full-on legal threat. They were taking me to court. I stared at the screen, feeling the weight of the fight pressing down on me. But instead of fear, all I felt was determination. They wanted a war. They had won. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. "Linda," I said the moment she answered. "I need a lawyer." The sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the lake, but I barely noticed. My mind was consumed with the battle that had escalated far beyond a simple property dispute. The HOA had pushed, threatened, and even tried to manipulate the entire neighborhood against me. Now, they were taking legal action. I had spent the last few hours gathering every document, every deed, every legal proof that this lake belonged to me and only me. Linda had been quick and ruthless, tearing apart the HOA's so-called claims with the precision of someone who had seen too many power-hungry organizations think they were above the law. But even with the legal fight underway, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about paperwork anymore. They had already proven that they were willing to cross lines, to come onto my land in the middle of the night and try to tear down what I had built. I wasn't stupid. If they were bold enough to do that, they weren't going to stop there. I was outside checking the fence, running my hand over the reinforced wood, when I heard a car pull up. The sound of the tires grinding against the gravel was slow, deliberate, like someone was making sure I knew they were here before stepping out. I turned, expecting another HOA lackey, maybe even Ted again with another smug warning, but instead, it was Karen. Her pristine white SUV gleamed under the last light of the sun as she stepped out, wearing that same tight-lipped expression of forced authority she always had when she thought she was in control. But this time, there was something different in her eyes. Something darker. She didn't wait for an invitation to step closer. She walked toward me, arms crossed, eyes scanning the fence like it was some kind of personal insult. "You've really done it now," she said, her voice sharp. "Do you have any idea the kind of trouble you're in?" I didn't react. I wasn't about to give her the satisfaction of thinking she had the upper hand. "The only trouble I see is you standing on my property." Her jaw twitched, but she didn't back down. "The entire community is sick of this. You're being selfish, blocking access to something that should belong to everyone. And now, thanks to you, we're in a legal mess." I let out a dry laugh. "You're the ones who started this. You think you can just rewrite property laws because it's convenient for you." I stepped forward, lowering my voice. "That lake is mine, Karen. No matter how much you want to control everything around you, that fact isn't going to change." She took a slow breath, and for a second I saw it. The flicker of rage, the realization that no matter how much power she thought she had, she couldn't intimidate me. But then, something unexpected happened. Instead of the usual condescending smirk or empty threats, she reached into her purse. My muscles tensed immediately. Every instinct screamed at me that something was wrong, that this wasn't just another HOA argument. Then, the cold glint of metal caught the last bit of sunlight. A gun. She lifted it just enough for me to see. Her grip unsteady, but her expression locked in determination. "You're going to take that fence down," she said, her voice low. Now, everything went silent. The wind barely moved. The world seemed to pause, the only sound my own heartbeat hammering in my ears. A lot of people talk about what they'd do in a situation like this, how they'd react when faced with the kind of insanity that turns a petty dispute into something life-threatening. But in that moment, standing on my own land with a woman so desperate for control that she was willing to pull a gun over a damn fence, I realized something. She wasn't in control at all. I took a slow step forward, just enough to close the distance slightly, but not enough to be reckless. Her hands twitched, the gun shaking just slightly. "You really want to do this, Karen?" I asked, my voice calm, steady. "You really think this is the way you win?" Her breath hitched, and for a moment I could see it doubt, uncertainty. She had crossed a line even she wasn't sure she could come back from. But the problem with people like Karen is that they don't know when to back down. "I don't lose," she hissed. That was when the siren split the air. The wail of police cruisers coming down the road was deafening, and before she could even process what was happening, blue and red lights flooded the property. A neighbor must have seen something, must have called the cops, and now Karen was standing there, gun in hand, caught in the act. She turned toward the flashing lights, her face draining of color, and in that split second of distraction, I moved. With one swift motion, I knocked the gun from her hand, sending it skidding across the ground. She gasped, stumbling back as two officers rushed forward, weapons drawn, barking commands. Hands in the air. "Now!" Karen stood frozen, her whole body shaking. She opened her mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to spin one last desperate excuse, but there was no talking her way out of this. Within seconds, she was in cuffs, the officers pulling her hands behind her back as she sputtered protests. "This is a mistake. He threatened me first. I was only defending myself." One of the officers, a stone-faced man who looked like he'd dealt with plenty of HOA nightmares before, barely glanced at her as he spoke. "You were holding a firearm on private property. That's all we need to see." I exhaled slowly, watching as they led her toward the cruiser. She turned once, just before they put her inside, her eyes wild with disbelief. "This isn't over," she snapped, voice breaking. "You're going to regret this." I stepped closer, looking her right in the eye as the car door slammed shut between us. "No, Karen," I said. "You are." The dust hadn't even settled before the fallout began. Karen's arrest had sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, splitting people into two camps: those who had always secretly resented the HOA's overreach, and those who clung to its authority like it was some divine mandate. The morning after her dramatic exit in the back of a police cruiser, the HOA board held an emergency meeting, no doubt scrambling to save face. The messages flooding my phone had taken on a new tone. Some were thinly veiled warnings, as if I had somehow overstepped by defending myself. Others were from neighbors who had never spoken to me before, quietly thanking me for standing up to the HOA, for refusing to let them run unchecked. The battle wasn't over yet, but the tides were turning. I could feel it. Linda called early, her voice sharp with satisfaction. "They're panicking," she said without even a hello. Their golden girl went too far, and now they're trying to figure out how to distance themselves from her without admitting they backed the wrong horse. I smirked, sipping my coffee as I looked out over my lake, the lake they had tried to take from me. "Let them squirm," I said. "What's next?" "What's next," Linda continued, "is that we make sure they don't get to sweep this under the rug. Karen might be the one in handcuffs, but the entire HOA pushed this. They encouraged her, they backed her, and now they need to answer for it." She was right. Karen had been the face of the fight, but she hadn't been acting alone. The whole HOA had supported the harassment, the legal threats, the vandalism. She was just the one stupid enough to take it to the next level. And now that she had, they were scrambling to protect themselves. By noon, an official HOA statement had gone out, one that was so full of meaningless corporate nonsense it was almost funny. They expressed their deep regret that a misunderstanding had escalated, distancing themselves from Karen's independent actions. No apology, no acknowledgement that they had been the ones fueling this from the start, just an attempt to pretend they had nothing to do with it. But I wasn't going to let them get away that easily. That afternoon, I drove straight to my lawyer's office, a folder of every complaint, every email, every attempt at intimidation stacked neatly in my hands. Linda met me at the door, her sharp grin telling me she already had a plan in motion. "We're not just fighting this," she said as I handed her the documents. "We're going to make sure they never pull something like this again." 2 days later, the lawsuit was filed. Not just against Karen, but against the HOA itself. Harassment, property damage, attempted illegal seizure of land. It was all there in black and white. A legal storm descending on the organization that had spent years bullying people into submission. And the best part? The neighborhood was watching. The same people who had whispered behind closed doors were now paying attention. They had seen Karen hauled off in cuffs. They had seen the HOA flounder, trying to justify what couldn't be justified. And now they were seeing me fight back in a way they never had the courage to. The backlash hit them harder than I could have expected. Within a week, 2 board members resigned, trying to get out before the storm truly landed. The ones who stayed behind scrambled to maintain control, but it was slipping. The more people saw the truth, the more they started questioning everything the HOA had done over the years. The excessive fines, the ridiculous rules, the way they had controlled people's lives under the guise of neighborhood standards. And now, with a lawsuit hanging over their heads, they were losing their grip. Karen, on the other hand, had gone silent. After her initial release, she had retreated into her house, avoiding the neighborhood entirely. No more smug looks, no more surprise visits. She had lost, and she knew it. The final blow came a month later, when the case went to mediation. The HOA, realizing they had no leg to stand on, caved. They dropped every claim, paid damages for the harassment, and, most importantly, were forced to issue a public statement admitting that the lake was, and always had been, private property. The victory tasted even sweeter when the HOA president resigned, unable to handle the humiliation of losing control. As for Karen, the charges against her stuck. She was fined, sentenced to community service, and ordered to stay away from me and my property. It wasn't as satisfying as seeing her behind bars, but knowing that she had gone from ruling the neighborhood to picking up trash on the side of the road, that was poetic enough. The day the last of the settlement papers were signed, I stood by the lake, watching the sun set over the water, the reflection calm, undisturbed. Emily came up beside me, slipping her hand into mine. "It's finally over," she said, her voice soft but sure. I squeezed her hand, exhaling slowly. "Yeah," I said, looking out at the lake that was and always would be mine. "It is."